Today's lesson is on right brain versus left brain thinkers. First, let's look a little bit about the human brain and get some information. The human brain weighs approximately 3 pounds and contains 100 billion neurons. Neurons are nerve cells. Like you have a regular cell in your body, but these are specialized for your nerves. Plus 100 trillion connections, and there are little gaps in between your nerve cells, in between your neurons, that are called synapses, and that's where the connections are made. The brain is the command center for what we think, also what we feel, and what we do. It's divided into 2 halves, which we call hemispheres. The particular regions control certain functions. Like we'll look at your temporal lobe is here. It controls your hearing. Your frontal lobe is mostly thinking. Your occipital lobe is seeing. Different lobes and different regions of your brain control different functions. There's a difference in how the different sides of the brain look and what they do. And then different sides of your brain are connected by nerve fibers. And scientists continue to map the brain. We gain more insight into what parts control the necessary functions. So all of these experiments are done to figure this out. Here's a little picture when we're talking about left brain and right brain thinkers. This is to represent the brain, and there's a little part here in the middle that connects the hemispheres called the corpus callosum. And that kind of integrates the right side and the left side of the brain together. Left brain is thinkers are said to think in words, think about sequencing, linear thinking, mathematics, facts, logic, science. Right brain thinkers are more about feelings, visualization, imagination, intuition, rhythm, holistic thinking, and the arts. The theory is behind the whole idea is that people are either left-brained or right-brained because one side of the brain is dominant. The theory first came to light in the 1960s by Robert W. Sperry, and he won a Nobel Prize. So let's look a little bit about what Sperry had to say. What was his research? How did he come to this conclusion about right brain and left brain thinkers? The research, Sperry studied brain functioning in patients who had that corpus callosum, that little part I told you that connects the 2 hemispheres, surgically severed. And why they did that was to treat epilepsy. They thought that if we sever this connection between the halves of the brain, maybe we can treat epileptic patients. Those patients, after they had that done, experienced other symptoms after that pathway between the 2 sides of the brain was cut. Many split brain patients found themselves unable to name objects that were processed by the right side of the brain, but they were able to name objects that were processed by the left side of the brain. Based on this, Sperry suggested that language was controlled by the left side of the brain. Things that we say, all of your language is there. His research revealed that the left side of the brain produces sentences, but the right side retains some language capacities such as understanding social context of speech. It's not only important to read the words, but we have to know what the words mean and in what context they come. There's a theory called brain lateralization, and that is the tendency for some neural functions, brain, or cognitive, that's thinking, processes to be specialized to one side of the brain or the other. The evidence supports there's some mental capacity that's predominantly on one side of the brain or the other, but science has overturned several earlier notions relating to the topic. Psychologists now consider functions like language and spatial reasoning to have brain lateralization. Language has used several brain modules, many of which are on the left side of the brain. Language neurons, however, may be split among both halves or located on the right side. That is more common in left-handed people because we're cross-brain dominant. Your right hand, and we'll look at that in a little bit, is controlled by the left side of your brain and vice versa. Left side of your brain contains an area that's called Broca's area. That's what produces those understandable sentences. You don't just say a bunch of words together that don't mean anything. This area integrates those into understandable sentences. And also Wernicke's area, and that makes someone able to understand speech when you hear it. So those 2 things are on the left side of the brain. Other language functions, like associating emotions with phrases, occur within the right side of the brain. So we were talking about emotional thinkers, feelings. Those are processed on the right side of your brain. So scientists have done what's called a WADA test, and they disable one side of the brain, and they do that chemically. They don't do it surgically. It's just something that they do to suppress one side of the brain, just to see how the other side operates. That would be like if you were using both hands to throw a ball and we tie one behind your back to see how well you use the other hand, sort of like that. Logical thinking, like language, often resides primarily within the left side of the brain, and the right side is more active involvement than the left in visual or spatial processing or recognizing faces. When you see someone, that right side of your brain tells you that's who that is. It recognizes faces. And it also deals with social perception too, like body posture. The right brain is used to focus one's attention. So we have different types of emotions. The left side of your brain is associated with positive emotions. The right side of your brain is associated with negative emotions. So they did some tests on people with depression, clinical depression, and they found out that they often suffer from a disproportionate ratio of right to left brain activity, meaning they have more negative emotions. They have a higher right brain activity than do the left brain thinkers. So it causes more depression because more of the feelings come from that side of the brain. Left brain processes new information into understanding of certain events, and your right brain accounts for social behaviors. Have you ever met someone who doesn't know how to act in social situations? They may have something wrong with their right side of their brain. They don't know what appropriate behavior is. The left brain breaks apart concepts into huge chunks that you can process, and the right brain synthesizes that information into a cohesive view so that you see everything. Peripheral nervous system, we're going to look at that. It's often called the PNS, just abbreviate. That would be your brain and your spinal cord or central nervous system. Periphery is out to the side, like peripheral vision. So those would be the neurons that come out from the brain and spinal cord to the sides. So the left brain receives connections from the parasympathetic nervous system. And what the parasympathetic nervous system does is it returns the body to a routine. It's called the rest and digest system. Kind of a calming effect. Let's go back to the start. Let's kind of understand and think about everything that we know. Whereas the right brain receives connection from the sympathetic nervous system, and that's the fight or flight. That's stress-related activities. When something stresses you, when cortisol is being produced in your body, how you react to that. That's a right brain. That's where that gets information, and the left is the other side. And if you think about it, a lot of times we do, when we're talking about spatial relationships, men have much better spatial relationship views than women do, and evolutionarily that would serve them better on the fields of wherever they are, looking, hunting, gathering, different things like that. They have to be able to see far away. They have to be able to process the information as it comes at them, so they receive connections here. And then if that line is charging you, you have to get connection here to run away. Together, those two halves of your brain, they work with the rest of the nervous system to maintain homeostasis, that certain level where everything is okay. The body is connected to the brain so that the senses, as well, control usually takes place within the opposite side, and that's what I just told you. The left side of your brain controls the right hand and the right foot and the right half of your visual field, and vice versa. The right brain controls the left hand, the left foot, and the left half of your visual field. The brain has evolved to have some symmetry. The right hemisphere is slightly forward, some asymmetry. The right hemisphere is slightly forward to the left hemisphere. People who have less of this asymmetry may suffer less effective thought processes, and sometimes that's associated with schizophrenia or mood disorders. Their brain isn't so, one side isn't so asymmetric, it's more symmetric, which changes those neural connections. The truth is, some brain functions reside more on one side of the brain than the other. But does that make some people left brain thinkers and others right brain thinkers? Let's look at some more current research. One problem with answering that question is that we first have to agree on what logical and creative even mean. So that gives us a baseline of what we're talking about. So let's take an example of math skills. That's an example of what the left logical center should be good at, correct? It said math and science. Those two kind of go together. There are various types of math skills. We calculate, we count, we estimate. And research shows that the abilities that make up math skills arise from processing that takes place in both hemispheres. The left hemisphere advantage for math is mostly seen for tasks like counting, reciting your multiplication tables. Those rely heavily on memorized verbal information. So we're looking at the left side more of verbal, rote memory. And then the right hemisphere, its advantages are things like estimating the quantity of set of objects. If we had a bucket here and we said how many pennies are in this bucket, and you could look at it and your right brain would kick in, kind of tell you more so how many would be there. The claim that the left hemisphere is the seat of language is a little different. The idea comes from observations that damage to the left hemisphere in patients that had strokes is associated with difficulties producing language. That's called aphasia. So if you damage that one part of your brain, you may have difficulty speaking. You can't produce language. You may be able to hear it in your mind, but not to speak. That does not mean that the right hemisphere is nonverbal. That's not true. The right hemisphere is involved in comprehending rather than producing language. So understanding what you've heard. Both hemispheres can figure out the meanings of words and sentences. So we have these new research techniques that kind of look at this, and they're more of an electrical thing. Measures of the brain wave activities, EEGs, ERPs, and those are used to investigate hemispheric asymmetries in patients with intact brains, ones that nothing are wrong with. So our brain activity, which is electrical, which goes back to the neurons and the synapses, those work by electrical charge. Sodium, potassium, and different chlorine, things like that. They look at the brain activity and provide information on how that process is unfolding over time. They look at the eyes, and the eyes are tracked to see what happens when we send information to the brain. Because you know that you see with your brain, you don't really see with your eyes. Eyes just provide the information to your brain. So we're tracking what happens as the eyes send that information to the occipital lobe, which is the visual processing center of the brain, and that focuses on what people pay attention to. What you're looking at, what you're paying attention to. So you see at times a lot of people, you'll talk to them and they'll be kind of looking around, so they're not really paying attention to what you're saying. And then as people pay attention to specific words, they, one, access its meaning from memory. You see an apple. In order for you to know that's an apple, you would have had to have seen one before. So it goes to and gets that memory and says, that's an apple. And it also adds new information to the unfolding understanding of any sentence that it's in. Excuse me. In some cases, they will decide how to respond, and then they'll press a button in this test. With that electrophysiological, meaning they're using electricity to study the processes, the measures, we can find out that the two hemispheres not only do something different, but they can also track when and how this is done, the two hemispheres of your brain. When the hemispheres are connected, don't they just share all of the information and operate together? So the left is sharing with the right is sharing with the left. That's not how it happens. They don't because they can't. That's not how your brain works. There are rich, dense networks of connections in the brain. We talked about the corpus callosum, and it is very small in comparison to the rest of those neural connections. So keeping those things separate is the smarter way to function. The right side storing things, the left side storing things, they're not really necessarily sharing that information until you need it. They divide up tasks and they work semi-independently while taking different approaches to the same problem, and that's a good strategy for the brain. If you and your friends were put in a group at school and you had to do a project, one of you may be artistic and want to do the drawing, one of you may be more verbal and want to do the presentation. So you're dividing up tasks, which is what your brain does according to which side of the brain that is most efficient at. Differences in hemispheric specialization. There are, of course, differences in how people learn and think. We have people who learn by hearing, people who learn by seeing, people who learn by doing, right? What they like and what they are like. So things that you don't like the same foods that your friends like, or you don't like the same colors. And what you look like, you may dress a certain way or think a certain way or do a certain thing. That's your individual brain. So some of those differences can arise because of the differences in how those hemispheres are organized, or which tends to be used in any particular situation. Lateralization of function changes with normal aging. So as you get older, the way those two hemispheres function changes. Those lateralized patterns tend to switch to bilateral patterns in healthy older adults. So this happens because older adults have better learned how to be both logical and creative. So sort of the longer your brain works, the more efficient it becomes. You're using those two sides of your brain together. This shift is helpful in bringing extra processing resources to compensate for age